Everybody. I don't see, oh, there's Jay. Well, hi, Jay.
Everybody, I'm over here.
Okay, great.
Over here. Whole
You're
crew's here.
Wellfleet DPW. There they are. So welcome to January 27th FinCom meeting. Tonight, we are continuing our slog through the budget season. And let me pull up the agenda for tonight would be a really good thing to do. Excuse me one moment here. There we are. So tonight we'll be talking to the Department of Public Works. There they are. Also to the Water Enterprise Fund folks. I'm assuming it's going to be Jim Hood at some point. And to the wastewater management folks, and they will be, Kurt and others will be joining us a little bit later. And aside from that, there are a couple of small things we need to attend to later on that we'll get to when we get there, having to do with some of the school stuff, but we're not going to do a deep dive on that tonight. I'd like to call the meeting to order now as of 7:06 and 29 seconds. And welcome everybody who's been good enough to join us. I hope everybody's had the opportunity to get the materials that were sent out. There are many of them. The DPW sent, I could do a quick count, but it looks like about 12 files, various spreadsheets on parts of the budget and narratives that go with them. And I think what I'm going to ask Jay, Mark, and others is that if you want to kind of lead us through, you know, a flyby
Sure.
of your documents in the order that makes sense to you. I'm looking at as facilities, operations, highways, and so on. But if you have a specific order that you'd like to, you know, bring them up, that would be great. And if you wouldn't mind, if you could start with the underlying rationale or what drove your budget decisions this year. One of the questions we've had in the run-up to the budget season was what Maria, I'm sure, has given you guidance in one way or another, but also just the guidance of your experience with the past year and looking forward to the next one, what you're anticipating in terms of where your challenges are and how that's reflected in the budget that you drew up, including that you're going, I noticed there's an awful lot of level funded items in your budget. In some ways, I always find that sort of interesting because it makes assumptions about what real costs are going to be going forward or how you can manage them. So if you wouldn't mind kind of speaking to how you put the budget together in addition to what's in it.
Well, of course. Thank you, Fred. Good evening, everybody. Of course, the challenges every year is to try to level fund, and that's what I've attempted to do with all 6 budgets. As a matter of fact, all of them are level funded with a couple of exceptions, which I'll go over when I get to that particular budget. As we all know, especially in our responsibilities here, a lot of this can be a little bit of a crystal ball. In other words, it's hard to predict a lot of repairs, especially on both vehicles and buildings. We do have a maintenance program for facilities, but you know, every now and again we can be stuck with a $10,000 repair, and that can throw the budget way out of whack. And sometimes that doesn't happen, but other times it can happen at least twice in one fiscal year. Then we're up against some reserve fund problems and requests, and that hasn't happened in a long time, thankfully. But there's 6 budgets that I just sort of like to go over with you. You can ask me questions as we go along, but I'd like to start with 417 facilities budget. This is the budget that we use to maintain 6 primary town facilities, buildings, and approximately 6 or 7 seasonal buildings, meaning things like beach bathhouses, bathrooms, that type of thing. But primarily 6 larger town facilities. In total, with these line items, which have all been, the budget in itself has been level funded. You'll see there's a lot of details. These are kind of like working details that we use for our own purposes more than the purposes of this meeting per se. But this year, when we were asked to present a budget, there were some figures that were askew. We needed to highlight those, but thankfully, the bottom numbers came out the same. So they're there just for the purpose of, if you see any differences, we had to highlight the numbers that were skewed, but the bottom numbers came out correct. So that's that. The facilities budget has been level funded.
Mark, before you go on, I think I want to ask Rebecca, because we talked about this a little bit earlier. As we go through these budgets, I think people will notice that the column for the TA budget is empty in some cases. And I believe, if I understood Rebecca earlier, it was just an omission, but that there's no variance there. So I just want people to understand that as we go forward, in case they're
That's
wondering
correct.
why that column is missing.
Yes, and my files, I had updated it for everyone, but the ones that I sent you, it didn't send the updated version. So Maria's met with every department and pretty much went over every line item with them and has agreed, she's seen the budget, she's agreed with them and really didn't want to change anything just because of this year. And then moving forward, we'll do what we need to do. But yeah, that's my fault. I didn't send to you as filled in like it should have. But there were no changes from the TA's perspective.
Jeff, did you have a question?
I have a question on line B1, the electricity, which is the largest item on the list. I'm curious, especially as we're looking into fiscal year 2022, what are we expecting to have happen once we finally get the solar panels hooked up at the transfer station, and what that might mean in terms of this particular line item?
I'm sorry, Maria, did you have some insight on that?
Well, what you're going to see on budget line items is the actual cost.
Right.
So what the department anticipates spending on electricity. So what the department anticipates spending doesn't change. Any revenue or anything that comes in from the solar panels would go into the general fund. And I don't know what those anticipated revenues are off the top of my head, even though I've been looking at it the last couple.
So just following up, and just so I have a sense going forward. So what we will see eventually then is that will be a source of revenue coming into the town from what we're selling.
My understanding is that it's not going to be a credit against the bills or invoices. It's going to be an actual proceed that's sent to the town.
That's my understanding also.
And I guess, are there limits in terms of how much that we're able to generate and sell based on our usage? I'm still a little unclear.
Our usage doesn't have any influence on what the revenue is. So, we have a contract. Once the power ever comes through, that 70% of what's generated is a credit for us, but it doesn't influence what the Public Works Department has to pay for electricity.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry. Yeah, if there aren't any other questions on 417, we can move to 420.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. 420 is the
Operations.
Yeah, there we are. Okay. DPW operations, this is a budget that we use for a lot of different aspects of the department, but mainly has to do with service on vehicles, and both in-house and subcontracted work. And you'll see there's also a lot of other items involved in that, things like office supplies, a lot of incidental items like that. Maintenance on our vehicles, the fire department vehicles. I have to mention that this budget was increased, but I have to, in order to explain that, I really have to go back to the facilities budget, and I should have mentioned this while we were on that. After speaking with Rich Pauley, Fire Chief, we were talking about the increased cost, especially as it relates to fire vehicles. That type of maintenance, and I've level funded that line for a lot of, for the past at least 5 years, and those creeks are increasing. There's a lot of annual maintenance costs on the fire vehicles as it relates to inspections, a lot of more items related to safety on the vehicles that need to be performed annually as opposed to, say, once every 2 or 3 years. So those costs have increased. And while I was talking with the fire chief, he indicated to me that there was an interest by his department to perform some of the, at the very least, custodial and maintenance duties related to the fire department itself, which are costing the town approximately $12,000. So his suggestion was if they could absorb that cost, could those funds be transferred over to the DPW operations budgets to put towards maintenance of fire vehicles? And I thought that was a great idea, obviously, because I was going to have to increase that line item. You'll see it as B12 under 420. So I've increased that line item by $12,000. You might say, well, why was 417 level funded then? Well, coincidentally, we had to take on some additional costs related to the new police department as it relates to security. Let's see, there was for preventative maintenance on entrance systems and other costs such as software upgrades on HVAC systems over there that needed to be performed. Coincidentally, those costs happen to be just about $12,000. So that sort of allowed me to just level fund that line item, and thus 417 budget was level funded. But in actuality, there was $12,000 taken out of that and then added on to line B12, repair and maintenance of fire vehicles. You can see in FY 2020 actual that those costs were $38,000. Obviously, $20,000 isn't going to cover that going forward.
Yeah, just quickly, Mark, I think you're saying B12, if I'm hearing that correctly, and on.
I'm sorry. B12 is a vitamin. B2 is a line item.
Yes.
Yeah, B2.
Okay, just
sorry.
to be.
So that was repair, maintenance, and fire vehicles. So I think I see Rich is here. We talked about that, and that worked out pretty good.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, it's
Yes,
Fire
please.
Chief. So what we have found in the last 7 or 8 months is we've had to shut down the fire station in terms of having an outside contractor come in and clean it. And we've done it ourselves. We've, adding a few more staff people. We've been able to do a good cleaning of the firehouse, the fire station for the last several months. And prior to this, we had an outside contractor custodian accomplish this for us. But now that we have a few more people on staff, we were able to do it in-house, which is very traditional in the fire service. So I had a discussion with the Public Works Director about the fact that the cost of fire apparatus maintenance continues to increase. It's just part of the reality. Every year we overexpend that line item for fire apparatus maintenance. So my suggestion, and Mark and I talked about it, was just to move that money out of what would have been from the fire department cleaning account, if you will, into fire department fire apparatus maintenance. That it's money that's better spent, better well spent, and I think it's a good value for the community, and it just is really reflective of reality. So, and I support completely Mark's point on this, that it's just the better way to do business from my perspective. Thank you.
So Chief Pauly, if I could, or Mark, that line B2 where the money has been, I'm assuming the money has been moved to that line that's described as repair maintenance of fire vehicles. Is that a more inclusive amount? You said the firehouse, like fire apparatus. Is it just the vehicles or is it more than that?
No, it's just basically the fire vehicles. It's the
Okay.
apparatus is what it is. Vehicles, that's where it is.
Yep. That's correct.
Could you speak to the A1 line, the cost of full-time personnel? It looks, it's gone up about 100,000 since FY20.
So that is the budget line for DPW full-time, 15 full-time staff. Obviously, there's been contract increases. The actual under FY 2020 could be a line that's skewed because we had at least one position that wasn't filled for a while. So what was actually spent was less than we normally would have. But the Teamsters negotiations contracts allowed for an increase for the majority of the staff here. So that's why that line went up.
So is that the FY22 line jumping from 911, say, to 979 and change? Is that a periodic change? Does that cover contractual relationships for multiple years, or is it a year-to-year thing?
That is a contract increase for that particular year. In other words, if there's a 3-year contract, whether it be 9% over 3 years, this would represent that percentage. So there's 2 different unions involved. Plus, there's there's a Welfare Employees Association union and a Teamsters contract. Both of those contracts have increased for the next 3 years. There were 3-year agreements. If that answers your question, Fred?
I think so. Does that mean that in, say, FY23, we'll see another similar jump as a consequence of it being an annual?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I just say real quick, I just love how you guys have worked together, and Chief Pauly, I mean, you seem to pull something off every year that is so surprising. This is great. I just wanted to, before it passes, really great, guys. Thank you.
Does anyone else on the committee have any other questions relating to 420 operations before we move on? Okay, thank you.
Go on to 422 DPW highways. This is the budgets that utilized for mainly road repair, drainage installation, drainage maintenance. There is a supplement of under B12, that $50,000, $50,400 actually. B1. Did I say B12? B1. That represents a supplemental amount that the town fronts towards Chapter 90 funds, we received a Chapter 90 funds every year of around anywhere between $250,000 to $300,000 a year. But a few years ago, it was decided that we should appropriate a supplemental amount going forward. And so that was added onto this highway budget. But that's basically used for repair of parking lots, some parking lot paving, some incidental type of road repair, something that Chapter 90 could also pay for, but I decided to add that to the highway budget about, I guess it was about 4 or 5 years ago. But
I should probably mention, we did not receive the spreadsheet that goes with the narrative. We received 2 copies of the 422 narrative. So I'm not sure we're seeing a description of all of the line items. All we see here is B1 to B6.
that's all that's in that budget, Fred.
Oh, okay, that is the entire
Yeah,
highway budget.
that's the entire budget for highways. Yep.
Okay, so there's no A section.
Nope.
Okay, well, thanks then.
That's a different vitamin, Fred.
What's that?
That's a different vitamin. He can't handle those right now. He's only into the B12s.
ODing on B1. Does anyone have any questions about the highway budget?
Okay.
Okay, moving on.
So now we move on to 423 DPW snow and ice snow removal. This again was level funded. A budget that's used to pay for snow removal for around 88 town roads and 134 private paved roads. There is an amount in there for snow overtime and to pay some subcontractors that we utilize during the winter time. This budget has been level funded now, I think, for 3 years. I usually, every 5 years, I will go back and average out 5 years, take out the high, take out the low, average the remaining 3 and divide it up in the appropriate line items. And that's how this budget's developed, because it's kind of tough to predict how a winter is going to play out. We've been lucky the last couple of years, but you never know.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, for those who have joined the FinCom in the last year or two, I think you just said it basically, that every year it is level funded because you're guesstimating how much snow removal there will be without having any foreknowledge one way or the other.
Yep,
Some years you save money, some years you may exceed the
Right.
budget.
yep, that's correct.
Okay. Any questions, anyone?
Okay, and we move on to 424 streetlights. Pretty straightforward. This is the budget used for maintaining 234 streetlights throughout town. Again, I think you've heard me say this before. We made through a grant, we had them all switched over to LED, I think 2 years ago, maybe 3 now. So it cut this budget in half, but this is used to pay for both the electricity and a certain amount of maintenance it requires periodically to maintain them. They're level funded.
I have a question on the streetlight budget.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding.
Hilarity ensues.
Are you looking at B12?
We actually have streetlights. Maybe that's the question.
Yeah.
Streetlights, where are they?
Okay, if there's no questions on that, I'll go to 433. Is that okay, Fred? 433 DPW transfer station. What's reflected in your budget shows that there is an increase that I'm asking for of $29,000. Within those numbers that you see highlighted, in actuality, under B2, Contract services, there was an amount of 29,000 added. That's not reflected in the FY 2021 budget. So the budget that we were actually working with was actually $220,000. And the reason that that was increased in the middle of the fiscal year is the renegotiation of our contract with New Bedford Waste. Now, I should explain what that's for. This line is used to pay tipping fees that we pay New Bedford Waste when we haul our own refuse, our MSW, and where it's tipped, we have a contract with New Bedford Waste to pay them the tipping fee. They have the right to renegotiate that. That was done, and obviously it increased to a total of around $29,000. It was 28,000 and change or something like that. But so Dan added that amount to contract services to bring that total to $220,000. The other thing that that line item is used for is disposal fees for our demolition. And also included in that is disposal fees or tipping fees for recycling and recycling of other things such as electronics, paint recycling. It's all included in that line for contract services. So in actuality, that line, that the budget was level funded, even though it's not reflected in this, what you have in front of you.
Mark, if I may, and I'm just going on memory here, so I may have this completely wrong. When we looked at the capital budgets this past fall, my recollection is that there was a truck in the DPW budget that was positioned to take some of the load off of the contract services and enable the town to do some of its own hauling going forward. Is that correct? Or
Yes, that's correct. Recycling and disposal fees are a moving target right now. So for a short explanation, Fred, I can say that that was put into the capital plan because after analyzing the recycling world per se out there and us both hauling some of it ourselves and paying other entities to haul it for us, breaking that all down, it's estimated we're going to save around $40,000 per year in our hauling costs should we acquire that vehicle. Not only that, we have a roll-up. A roll-up truck is used to haul containers to market. We have one now. It's one that we got years ago. We bought it used. We put some money into it, fixed it up. We use it right now just to haul glass, and that's only because it's being hauled to Dennis. All of our other recyclables are going off Cape, which is much a longer distance, obviously. So we need something that's more formidable and reliable. But not only that, but being as it's going to save the town at least $40,000 a year in hauling costs per year, we thought it was the way to go. Not to mention we have to replace the truck that we have now anyway. So that, among some other reasons, is the reason that that's in the capital plan.
so if it saves 40,000 a year, my guess would be that if you want to think of it, I don't know how it actually works out in the budget itself, but in a way it's paying for itself over a period of time. So you pay so much for a truck, you get 40,000 back. Over time, there's a break even. Does it last long enough, I guess is the question, to have an impact on B2 in the transfer station where you actually start to see some savings in the contract services as well? Or is it apples and oranges?
It's hard to tell based on the cost of recycling. I wouldn't want to commit to that. The hauling cost is into that contract service, Fred. Yes, you're right. So theoretically, it should. It's just so hard to determine what the actual tipping fees and the costs associated with recycling will be. I know.
So they might moderate the increases and not actually decrease anything.
I'm sorry?
It might moderate the increase in
That's
cost
right. Yeah,
rather than decrease costs.
that's possible.
All right. Anyone? Anyone have any questions about the transfer station? What is it? It's a free ride tonight. I think it always is, though. You guys do such a good job.
Wow.
You're not letting your cohort speak there. What's up? Say
You're
anything?
doing such a great job. Oh, yeah. Don't say that. Don't say that.
Great job, Mark.
Oh, they're here for morals. Everybody's here for moral support.
That's
looks like
because
a-
they've taken their vitamins.
It looks like a hostage video.
That gets us through all of the components of the budget. You may recall, Mark, from last year, we had changed, 2 years ago, I guess, before I was chair, we had changed our practice by not issuing recommendations or not in line, waiting till we had heard all of the departments. It's kind of, we changed that last 2 weeks ago because Chief Pauly and Chief Hurley did such a magnificent job. The finance committee decided overwhelmingly that we should go, yeah, right on in the moment. I'm perfectly fine, by the way, polling the committee because I think I know where it's going to go. But having said that, it did occur to me that all of these deep dives or deepish dives into the various department budgets still aggregate up at the end because we vote on an operations budget at the end of the day, not on individual departments. So I think this exercise, hopefully for you, is a chance to get on TV and explain how things are, and for us to get knowledgeable about, for example, the increases in personnel costs. Maria, you had,
I just wanted to, give kudos to Jay and Mark and the staff for getting funding for the backhoe recently approved. So I'm not sure if we had that in this year's CIP, but they were able to get funding through the state, I guess, to pay.
it's
for
in
that.
every year's CIP. That backhoe has a way of showing up in almost.
I know
every-
it, yeah.
But this time around, you're able to get funding from the outside for it. Am I correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Maria.
So we don't have to
I think
fight that
before-
battle at town meeting again.
Right, right.
Before we officially say thank you, I think it's worth polling the members of the committee who are online on the question of whether the finance committee is inclined to recommend the DPW budget in its entirety and in its parts. I would love a motion from someone to that effect.
I will motion that.
Okay, a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so I'm going to say aye. Jeff?
Aye.
I want to see who's next on my list here. Jen? You can raise your hand if you're muted. Yep, that's an aye. Linda?
Aye.
Kathy?
Aye. Oh, I was gonna say present, but aye.
Sarah? Sarah, you're muted and invisible.
Aye.
Bob?
Aye.
Okay, so we are unanimous, and I lost track of the count, but I think it's something like 7 or 8, yeah?
Fred, thank you for not polling the police and fire chief. I really appreciate that.
Feeling I know how that would go. As the old Laurel and Hardy thing, who was it? Hardy would always go, one hand washes the other. All right, well, thank you, so much, guys.
Thank you.
All right, bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you, you too. I don't see Jim Hood online. The next item on the agenda is the Water Enterprise Fund.
I can
Rebecca?
actually give you a little update if you want.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So what I sent out to you guys is not this year's, obviously, it's last year's. Not much is going to change. The only thing that I think will change, and I'm going to go over this with Maria when we get a chance to meet with Heather in the next couple days. The only thing that will really change is I actually think it will be a higher revenue because since we've hired Penachuk, they are a lot more equipped to charge for service fees, to charge for late fees, to charge for just anything like changing a meter, bringing a new meter in, taking an old meter out. They're just a lot better at doing that, and they charge for that. Where before, it was very difficult when I walked into the water office to know what was going on. It took me a good year and a half to figure out who was on water, who wasn't, get all the files updated. So I think if anything's going to change, it's going to be the revenue line, and it will be more money. So, which is good for the enterprise fund. And then we'll also see a lot more increase because the water project that was just approved down Briar Lane, we're hoping to get a lot of people on town water down there as well, because quite a few people have shown interest in connecting to town water. And within the last month to 2 months, I've had probably 20 hookups. So just around town, and people that are off Main Street. Squires Pond Lane is one. I've had actually quite a few inquiries in the past 2 weeks about having a line put down Squires Pond Lane. So the only thing I think will change is the revenue part. I just don't know the exact revenue at this time, but I can bring it back to you when we've met with Jim and Maria and Heather.
So thank you, Rebecca. I'm not sure if this is a question we can ask in Jim's absence or not. But
Kurt
since you
might be
brought it,
able to help you too, because Kurt's on the water commissioners as well.
okay, Kurt, you're more than welcome to jump in. Because there is that new water line being brought up down Briar Lane, do we anticipate, for example, higher personnel costs? Is there more maintenance envisioned in the next year or two? Are there any light items here that, like contract services or B5 contracts or contingencies? Does anything get bumped up because we are expanding the system?
Well, I'm very hard to replace, so we're looking for my replacement. So I'm just kidding. I'm totally joking. I don't think so, but again, Kurt might know better than I would.
It's a good question, Fred. The only thing that I can think of offhand that will go up is electricity for pumping, because we will be pumping more water. But other than that, Whitewater's contract doesn't change, so that's the subcontract for operating the system. When you're putting in new pipes, you're obviously not going to be looking at, any kind of increase in operations and maintenance costs. We do have parts of the system that are aging. We are looking at doing a complete cost of service rate design change that would probably be revenue neutral, but do away with some of the restrictions, or I should say barriers to entry for people connecting. Right now, we've got a pretty expensive hookup charge, which tends to discourage people from connecting to the system. So there's some things that we're, as Rebecca said, there's some things that we're doing, in other ways that we really do hope to be able to boost revenue. But to your question, other than electricity, I can't think of anything offhand that from an operating standpoint that would increase as a result of the extension.
Hi, Fred, can I address this, please? It's Helen.
Hi, Helen.
To answer that question.
You look very comfortable, by the
And
way.
Kurt sometimes very judiciously adds what I'm about to say, and sometimes he doesn't. Initially, of course, there will be some revenue from hookup charges, but it's sort of like the first one is free. Hookup charge doesn't make it free. The main cost for any of these extensions is in the future. And much more money is going to be spent on this in the long term, replacing pipes and maintenance going into the future forever, right? Not just the next 10 years, not just for as long as the debt service for the initial cost, right, of adding more pipes, adding a new length. Debt service will get paid off at some point. But after that, there will be regularly high costs for replacing pipes and the maintenance, and they should be being checked for leaks regularly, which isn't always done as far as I can understand. Maybe it will be in the future. Through you, Fred, to Kurt, does the existing system have the routine leak checks from one of those special companies, the way the state sort of wants you to do it?
We're actually, it's an interesting question. We're actually looking at doing two things on leaks. One is, yes, if there's, if there's a problem with a meter, we know pretty quickly that there's a leak. And then we do have a specialized service that has the ability to go in and look for those leaks, hunt them down, and take care of them. We've had several in the past, and right now the system has responded fairly well to those. We do have concerns about it. The other thing is we're in the process of looking at a new meter reading system. The new meter reading system eventually will give us the ability to do real-time readings, which would be much, much, much better as far as leak detection, because you'd know very quickly if somebody's running outside a normal usage band and be able to pinpoint that leak quickly. In addition to that, we're also looking at what our leak rate is on the system as a percentage of total production to be able to start really aggressively minimizing whatever other kind of leaks we have on the system that might be minor, but to improve system operation. So we are doing several different things on leak detection.
Yes, and so to the committee, remember what this means is when you have that kind of monitoring going on, the more pipes you have, the more it costs. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Can I just repeat what Helen didn't say? Which is that basically the water system will never be self-sustaining, and that the role of the town is to subsidize that, and that needs to be addressed at some point. Is that what I think you're not saying?
Well, I've said it so many times before that I thought I wouldn't take up your time by repeating
No,
it.
it's a good message.
Okay, so here's the thing, guys. What you don't want are betterments. And why is that? Because if you don't want to hook up and you're still having to pay just because you're along that line, which is what betterments do, you have an incentive to hook up that isn't because you need to use the resource. Now, initially, with the first big expansion of the water system in the early 80s, when I was a water commissioner, I was on the Water Issues Advisory Committee. Most of you know that, but maybe not all of you do. Betterments were not included because of that reason. It was, in a sense, unethical to have betterments included. I still feel that way, knowing more than I did then. I knew quite a lot then. But where I'm going with this, Jeff, is you're right. And that's just the way it is. In other words, the water commissioners, and I think they would be quite wise to do this, could charge more money for A, the hookups, and B, the water rates could be higher, and they could have the water rates be different seasonally. And it would be less of a kind of loss leader into the system. And so that only the people that really needed water, right, would be hooked up to it. And they could pay all their costs if they did that. And then there's another mechanism that I'm not going to go into that Stephen Polosic has, outlined a few times. But that's the basic way that most water systems pay their bills, what I just described. And I think there's something not okay about saying to people, oh, we're going to make the hookups cheaper. And we want you to hook up even if you don't need water because we need to pay our bills. But the way it is now, Jeff, you're absolutely right. The town will always have to cover some of it. And that's a choice the town made rather unwittingly back in the early 80s. Thank you.
So let me say this about that, is from a finance committee perspective only. For those who have skied, if you stand at the top of a run and you're looking down the run and wondering whether you can do it or not, once you tip your skis down the hill, your choice is over. You are on your way, you're picking up speed, and you have to get to the bottom somehow. And that's the deal. Once you've started on the journey, you're on it. And every year we have an open question to the Water Enterprise Fund, and this goes back 5 or 6 years to when I first joined, when the shortfall was in the nature of $60,000-$70,000. It is now in excess of 130. It goes up a little bit every year, and I think from the Finance Committee's perspective, when you look at a system like this, there are a number of factors that either increase the cost or decrease the cost. You run it more efficiently, you're able to get more hookups, you charge more for the hookups, you do a betterment fund. There are any number of ways you mitigate the balance between expanding the system that is running downhill, if you like, because it is now a thing. Wellfleet has a water system that it funds, and how you pay for it as you expand it. And the real question from our perspective, I think, is to get the best advice or the best insight we can get on how rapidly that shortfall is likely to increase, if it's going to increase, or are new revenues going to mitigate against that increase and at least hold the line? Or are we going to see every year that it crawls up and up and up, and that we just project forward? This is a cost, in a sense, a cost of doing business. Wellfleet provides a water system, and at some point we go, well, gee, for the price of mitigating it every year, we could fund a long-term bond to put in a massive water system, and provide water on a town-wide basis. I can't imagine at this point that we'll ever get to that point, but you could see that there would be a break-even point where if it's costing you, I'll make up a number, $300,000 a year to pay for it out of pocket, you might say, I don't know, we could find a way to fund something more significant and pay 300 to debt. Really, the question from my perspective is, and I guess I'm asking Kurt, Rebecca, because Jim's not here, and we don't have the FY22 budget in front of us, so there is that as well. Are we projecting, with the increased hookups, with the new line, that the cost to the town is going to increase significantly, stay roughly the same, or decrease in any way at all?
Well, like I said, the direct cost to the town is, increased pumping cost. So it really, I don't want to get into the bigger picture financial discussion about betterments and how to fund the system. Right. I think you summarized it quite accurately, Fred. That we have a system. Here's what it is. The history here is that the deficit has been increasing over time, just as you said. Went from 60,000 maybe 5-6 years ago. It was I think it was greater when the DPW was involved, but anyway, the history doesn't really matter. The deficit has been increasing. That's the bottom line. And so to your question, which I think is the real salient one, what we're trying to do is address how to bend the curve, how to change that trajectory. With about 70 more customers connected to the system, we're at break even. So, Helen brought up the issue of water rates. That's why we're looking at rates. The feeling that we have right now is if you reduce the cost to connect and you increase the charges for water, you're going to get more customers on the system and they're going to be paying more for their water. And that's a financial recipe that has a much higher probability of beginning to change that trajectory of this growing deficit. The other thing is we also need to, in the context of talking about rates, be recovering enough money to cover the expected operating and maintenance costs as the system gets older. As everybody said, as we know, it's going to get more expensive as you start to replace pipes. That's not built into our rate structure right now. So clearly, the issues that you're raising are right on point as far as long-term cost of the system. And ultimately, I think as a water commissioner, I'm just speaking more for myself at this point, not for the board, but I see our responsibility is figuring out how to get it to pay for itself, how to get closer to break even. There's always going to be a subsidy coming from the town for the system, no matter what. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, the fire hydrant service that exists around town is a betterment to the entire town. So there's a rationale for the town kicking in for reduced insurance rates, et cetera. Plus it's infrastructure we have to maintain, and you can't charge, there's no ratepayer to pay for that. The other thing is the town currently gets water, and meaning the town of Wellfleet itself, not its citizens, but the town's a customer. So there's always going to be a payment coming from the town to the water system to pay for water from the town. So there are a couple of inherent costs, and a reason for, some sort of long-term subsidy to the water system. The question is how to get that capped, how to get that to a point where it's, within the confines of what one would expect for increases in water costs to the town. I got onto the board primarily because I saw this exact same scenario unfolding of increasing connection or increasing the system as a whole, a system that isn't paying for itself, and trying to figure out how we can do that, how we can start to change this trajectory. So it's a reasonably complicated issue. Part of our last year's budget authorized by town meeting was to hire a consultant to come and start to look at our water rate structure and our financial model so that we can begin to address these issues. So I don't want to go on much more than that, but everything that everybody's raised is absolutely valid. And the board is looking at this as a responsibility that we've got to undertake to change the trajectory and have a clearer, more transparent discussion with the town about long-term costs and what the town's actually paying for.
Well, yeah, I think I agree with that, and particularly that it would be useful from the perspective of our committee to have that perspective when we're reviewing the costs and the budget, because, one of my favorite political quotes of all time was Everett Dirksen in the late 50s. He was the leader of the House, and he said, in relation to federal budgets, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. I don't know what the threshold number is for the deficit where people go, oh my God, it's now 150 or 200,000 or whatever, but it would be great to have a little bit of foresight before it gets to that level to understand what the mitigating factors are and all. And I guess we're looking to the Water Enterprise Commission to provide that at some point. And this feels, it feels like every year we're reacting to a number, instead of saying, yeah, we see the long-term vision here, 3 years, 5 years out, and here's what connections will do, here's what maintenance is going to cost us. This is likely to be what the town's going to be paying. It says 10% more a year, 20% more a year. Or it flattens, as you put it before, flattens the curve, and we can look forward in 2 to 3 years because of good maintenance, good management, that suddenly the costs come down a little bit. But we don't have any insight into that at this point. We're always in this mode of just reacting to the deficit, really. So,
Right. We don't have a 20-year plan.
Or even a 5-year plan.
Yeah, or even a 5-year plan. But we do know that by adding about 75 customers, we get to break even.
Okay.
By reducing losses on the system, we reduce the cost of the system. We do know that if we can change our rate structure, that's going to get us another direction toward break even. So there are obviously a number of tools in the toolkit that we're working with. And, if I would hope that we'll be able to come to you next year with something that does look like a, 5, 10, 15, 20-year long-term financial plan.
Thanks. I saw two hands. Kathy had her hand up.
Thanks, Fred. I feel like, and you summed it up very eloquently. I feel like we're back to last year and the previous year with the fund, with trying to look and see what the future will hold, which kudos to you for coming up with the strategic planning portion of what we took on as responsibilities a few years ago. And I like that you said we're reacting to the budget. So today we really don't have anything to do other than say, this is the number that we're presented with, because we don't have the ability to go back and look at some recourse. But from a strategic planning standpoint, I think you're right. We have to get a grasp on what the future costs of this are. And I'm just going to say on a personal note that from a municipal finance standpoint, this makes my head want to explode, because this is not the way that the private sector does things. And it's really difficult to kind of react and say, I'm going to vote tonight in favor of this number because there is no other opportunity to do anything differently for this. So we're kind of at the mercy here of that. But I would like to see exactly what you suggested and support that we need to get a handle on what the future expenses are. But another point with that thought in mind with what we're thinking about right now, we should really kind of use that paradigm to consider all of the budgets that we're looking at and all of the larger enterprises that we're going to go into in the future as far as what's the cost down the road and what aren't we looking at today. So I think it's a nice way to look at municipal finance, and I appreciate your input. But we got to get a handle on what the costs look forward and how they're going to be distributed.
Maria, was that a thumbs up or was that a? Did you want-
No, I don't know. I had an office in a water department for about 11 years and, you know, went through lots of discussions on optimization for water and wastewater. You know, some of the things that were looked at in expansion of systems was whether or not, and I just went through this in Annapolis when I was there, you know, we had, for instance, put in the secondary line so that we could get sprinkler systems in buildings on Main Street. And because those taps are so expensive, you know, it's about $10,000 to tap our main. And really the service to the community was making sure that we had as many fire connections as we could for sprinkler systems, because, you know, one building burns, one's next to burn too. When we installed that water main, we installed it with taps already in it. So there was still a connection charge, but it, you know, if you can get that connection charge down, you're a lot more likely to get customers on that water main. So, you know, thinking of how you're financing putting that new pipe in, one of the things that ought to be included in your rate study or whoever's going to look at it is when it's installed with the taps, put it in the first place. Because that is an option. If you're charging $6,000 to $9,000 to tap that main, I tell you right now, there's a water main that goes right in front of my house in Eastham. I'm not paying that. I'd rather have a well. You know, that's a big chunk of change. But if that tap was already there and it wasn't going to cost me that amount of money, I might consider it. So, you know, you may want to look at whether you got the cart before the horse and whether you're really encouraging enough folks to you know, get those 70 customers or not by putting the investment in on the front end.
And that's actually the way the system was built, Maria. The taps are in. We also have an ability to live tap within the system, so we don't have to outsource for that.
But we're still charging them $6,000 and $9,000 to connection.
Yeah, and that's the problem.
That's a problem.
That's a problem.
Because that's usually the cost of tapping it.
Right.
It's already tapped and we're still charging them. Who's going to sign up for that?
Right. Exactly.
Who's going to sign up for that? So
I think from the outset, there's been a concern with the water system in general. And it applies somewhat to Eastham's experience as well, is that Wellfleet is a pretty widely scattered town in terms of, I mean, a couple of years ago, there was talk about saline in the wells out by Indian Neck. And does it make any financial sense to run water pipes out there to help those folks because their wells are getting salty?
mine's salt.
What's that?
I said I've got salt in my water.
Yeah, so there's that. And the sense, at least that I've had over the last few years, is that we are sort of creeping up on a broader system, that it's not by design, it's piecemeal. We started with the downtown part, now we're adding a part. At some point, it starts to look like an enterprise or system-wide system. I don't know where the crossover is, but an understanding that there are some remote homes who may never see a water main coming down their road, but wouldn't it be better, at least from the town's finance perspective, again, getting back to the role of our committee, to get some foresight into what the plan is? Are we looking at doing more extensions to get more and more of the town connected, or is it going to be piecemeal? If no one has anything else to say about this, I'm going to suggest that we not. Oh, Chief Paul, yes.
Just please indulge me for a moment, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
I brought this up a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, that at the National Seashore, the Marconi location, they have their own water system, which is very limited. It is, has very limitations in terms of the size of the tank, in their wells. And I have advocated since I've been here to try to come up with a plan to connect the town's well fleet, the town well fleet's water system with the National Seashore. And to do that through federal funding. So it's basically put into a bill or a situation that we get a good amount of federal funding to do that and run a line from the last hydrant, the last water pipe on Route 6, which is at about Cumberland Farms location, right down to the Marconi station, connect the two systems, have a mutual agreement, and then you would have a significant amount of commercial businesses that would be able to take advantage of that water system through fire protection purposes and also through domestic purposes. And that's going to take a federal input. It's going to take a federal, assistance with that. But I don't want to lose sight of that possibility and that potential that it could really make a big difference for the town of Wellfleet and for fire protection purposes, and certainly for the water system to be able to have good income coming off the system. And I think those are conversations that need to happen at the state and federal level. And I think that something good could happen from this down the road, certainly way after I'm gone, but or after I retire, I should say.
Please. You're a young man. You have everything to live for.
But after I retire, but I think that's a good conversation to have, and particularly in the current administration, certainly the next 4 years of looking at things at the federal level, with federal and local and state partnerships. I think there's something to be something that's value there, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Fred, I had one more response to that, please.
Sure.
It's Helen. With respect, Chief Polly, those lots on the way to the Marconi station, they all have perfectly good water. And the thing that hasn't been brought up is that the aquifers, and it isn't all just one big lens. Exactly. There's a lot you can look at about this. I'm not going to go into it. But we are not like Eastham, which has a much deeper land mass. And drawing down on our various lenses has much more impact than it does in the lower, the rest of the Cape, where there's more land mass. Okay. The other thing is, you don't need a consultant if you're a water commissioner to simply figure out how many miles of pipe, how many feet, and present people when you're asking for extensions of the water system with how often they have to be replaced. Roughly it's every 30 years, but some of the pipes that were put in about 20 years ago, slightly less, have already had to be replaced. That costs money. You can just put that out there. You don't need to hire a consultant for that. And you can, figure out how much more it might cost in the future in terms of labor and, replacement. And it's pretty easy to do a 5-year plan. It's not that complicated. And the finance committee should have these numbers and have that kind of idea so that when you consider what the expenses are of having a water system as they currently are, you're also thinking into the future and realizing that expenses that are paid for now are going to be paid for more in the future. Do you see what I mean? It extrapolates kind of, or it cube roots. Thank you.
Ellen, I respectfully, I understand what you're saying, but I do know that, and I've worked in 2 different states in communities that have municipal water systems. And like everything else, there's investments, and you invest in your home, you invest in your community, and those communities that have a well-structured municipal district water system have higher, have properties that are better valued. We understand we have to reinvest in them. You have better fire protection, And again, respectfully, you and I tend to disagree on this issue, and I understand that. But this is a matter of about better property values, better fire protection, better life safety. So it's like anything else. When you have to buy a fire engine every 20 years, you have to buy the fire engine. When you have to buy the ambulance every 7 years, you have to buy the ambulance. It's just a reinvestment into the community, and it's just reinvestment into property values. And that's how I see it.
Yes, but our
Fred,
resource
excuse
is
me.
not unlimited. That is different.
Fred,
It's not unlimited.
Yes, Kathy.
can I just bring this back a little bit? I think we've gotten away from the fundamental purpose of the finance committee and started
Right.
discussing what should come back to the water committee and how to better advance and then get the budget under control so we're not reactionary. So I think that this is a discussion outside of the scope of the finance committee. But when the water commissioners come up with something, we'd love to have input in it, but I'd like to just kind of get back to the budget instead of a debate on
Yes.
proceeding as far as how we're going to fix the issue. We've identified the issue. We've asked for input in the future, and I don't think it's within our scope to have the discussion of how that happens now. But
Yeah, I think that's well said, and
Well put, Kathy. And
we can probably agree that it's a big issue for the town going forward and an expensive one potentially. And we are interested in the outcome from a finance committee's perspective, particularly because, as you pointed out before, we are trying to take a more strategic view of the long-term costs associated with managing the town. But we're not going to boil the ocean tonight because it's above our pay grade. We don't understand the issues because they are complex and they're related to almost every aspect of life in this town in one way or the other, to the point that Chief Pauly made and Helen made and Kurt, that there are touch points between home value, ease of putting out fires, accessibility of clean water, and so on and so on. And we can't solve that problem tonight in any capacity. Jeff, you have something to say before we put closure on this?
Yeah, I sort of want to just get to the close. Just as we were able to recommend the police, the fire, and the DPW, we don't even have the 2022. And I think we're going to be revisiting this before town meeting. And so I think if we could kind of get this one to bed at this point.
I agree. I was about to say, I don't think we have enough information at this point to take any kind of recommendation, at least until we see the FY22 budget anyway. So I'm going to suggest that we let this dog lie for a little while and we'll revisit it when the time is right.
do you need a motion to postpone or revisit, or it's just tabled?
I don't think we do.
No,
I
I
think
can
we can
just
just
in your
table it.
minutes, I can write no action was taken. And
Yeah.
then, like I said earlier, I'll get together with Maria and Heather and we'll figure out, kind of give some sort of projection of what's gonna happen so that you guys have a better idea of what to vote on.
I love votes, but I don't want to get
You're a
overly
treasure,
formal on this.
Rebecca. You're a treasure.
I hear,
Thanks, you're so
I hear
cute.
sound. Well, as you may have noticed that I jumped over the reading and the approval of the minutes. With your permission, Kurt, before we get on to wastewater, I'd like to kind of go back to the beginning and entertain a motion to approve the minutes unless somebody has, oh, what a cute baby. Hi. Hi.
Motion to approve.
Unless someone has an issue with the minutes, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve them. This is for January 13th, when we met with Chief Hurley and Chief Pauly.
Motion to approve.
Any second, please?
Second.
Okay, Jeff,
Aye.
Linda,
Aye.
Jen,
Aye.
Kathy,
Aye.
Sarah,
Aye.
Bob,
Aye.
and I am also aye. Jen, I will say, I've gotten to know the top of your head really, really well, and sometimes your eyes.
It's part of my plan.
It's excellent. It's well executed. Good
She's
job.
mysterious.
Very.
No roots.
So with that, we're we're into the more speculative part of the meeting, which is Kurt and is there anybody else on from wastewater, Kurt, besides you? I don't see anyone.
Hillary was going to try to make it, and Scott is he's actually in another meeting that he's trying to break out of, and may or may not join us. What my thought was is to try to provide an overview here, and I don't know, Rebecca, if I can share my screen.
Yep, I can. Let me just make it available and you can.
And let me just say, before you do that, there were two documents that were distributed to us by Kurt. One is titled Preliminary Cost. It's a PowerPoint. And the other is titled Wellfleet Wastewater Committee Update, January 5th, 21, or 01/05/21. Also a PowerPoint, which, as I understand from Kurt, is a deeper dive into the numbers. I'm guessing, Kurt, that you're going to focus mostly on the overview?
Yeah, my thought was to do a high-level overview, get some perspective. I think we've got a little bit better handle on long-term projections with wastewater, and we've done a lot more due diligence in that regard. So what we try to do is put together a financial overview where we are this year, next year, and probably over the next 20 years from a financial perspective, and what we ultimately think we need to start thinking about as far as funding wastewater mitigation in the town of Wellfleet. Up till now, the only monies that have been spent have been $500,000 for an analysis of alternatives with a consultant over about the last 7 years to basically come up with alternatives that would make sense in the town. During that period of time, the whole entire process was changed. We've now got a new what's called 208 process. You guys are familiar with this, which now allows us a lot more flexibility in terms of handling wastewater in the town of Wellfleet. So
before you go on, I know Stephen had a question at our last meeting about that 500,000, how much had been spent, how much was left, and that sort of thing. If you could just briefly address that, we can at least dot that I and move on.
yeah, we've been trying to get the numbers from the town accountant. I think there's about 86, maybe 50 to 80,000 left in that. But we've been trying to get a meeting together with the town accountant for the last couple of weeks to get an exact answer, but rough round numbers, that's about what's left.
She's on the line here if you want to ask her.
Without doing the research, I wouldn't want to put somebody on the spot, but we need to nail that down. There was also some discussion about last year's wastewater town meeting article and where those funds were. So we're still trying to get some of those kind of answers, as well as how much money is coming into the town right now from the new short-term rentals tax, which theoretically would be going toward water and wastewater. So we have some other financial questions that we're trying to nail down. But short answer is it's about 50 to 80 left over from the original 500,000 to the best of my knowledge.
Okay. So if you want to have Rebecca put your screen up and we can do the overview, that'd be fine.
You're all set to go, Kurt. You can screen share.
All right, thank you. So you've got two documents. This one really is just a high-level overview of what we think are going to be the costs for wastewater over the foreseeable future, and kind of a mix of programs that are involved in that process. The more detailed document, which is a download, kind of goes into specific detail for every one of these bullet items that you see under preliminary cost estimates. So effectively, we've got a group of projects that will ultimately allow us to be in compliance with our 208 mandates, and do it in a way that's significantly less expensive than building a sewage treatment system, with a set of really kind of interesting alternatives that even even Barnstable County now is starting to model, at least some of what we've been thinking about particularly with regard to the innovative and alternative septic systems. And I'll start to go into this in in a little bit of detail, but I don't want to dive in too deep. I want to kind of give you a surface overview and then leave opportunity for questions anywhere that people want to dive in deeper. But
Well, before you go on, I'm not seeing it on, I'm on an iPad right now.
oh,
I'm
okay.
not screen share here at all.
Let me see.
Anybody else seeing it?
I don't
No,
see it.
I
You
don't.
gotta go to the bottom, Kurt, and hit the green button that says screen share. Pick on what you want and then hit share.
Okay. Here it is. Is that working for you?
Yes.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Sorry about that.
No
So-
worries.
So basically what we're intending to do is propose about a $1.5 million budget for next year for wastewater. Looking at this over 20 years, this wastewater is probably going to cost the town of Wellfleet somewhere between $20 and $40 million is our best guess at the moment. I'll get into that in a little bit, but I wanted to get, at least a high level overview. This is something that we have to do. It's required, it's mandated by DEP. And I'll go into how this process looks like compared to what we'd otherwise be doing if we were building a sewage treatment system. But effectively, we're talking about something that looks like 1.5 for next year. But I've got a slide at the very end, which also goes through where there's significant amounts of grant funding to reduce this cost, perhaps as much as 20, 40, 60%. So what the town's ultimately on the hook for would be different. So quickly, the main components of the plan involve, instead of building a sewage treatment system, it's much less expensive to do treatment on site. Basically with what's called an innovative and alternative septic system, it amounts to adding a wood chip component. For about $12,500, you now have a septic system that's treating wastewater to a level of removal that's equivalent or even slightly better than a sewage treatment system. And at the same time, you haven't engaged in putting in the pipes, you haven't engaged in the long-term operations and maintenance that Helen raised earlier with the water system. You don't have the energy costs. So from a carbon footprint standpoint, there are just so many benefits to doing on-site treatment. In addition to that, you actually remove some of these other contaminants that are in wastewater. They call them contaminants of emerging concern, things like pharmaceuticals, healthcare products, cleansers, a lot of different things go into your wastewater stream besides poop and pee. And these wood chip systems tend to break those components down. With a sewage treatment system, they tend to get concentrated and then discharged someplace else. Suffice it to say, this innovative and alternative septic system approach, by providing a subsidy for the wood chip component and applying it to just either new systems that are being put in the ground or a failed system, we in the town have about 60 of those systems that are being replaced every year. The other thing about those 60 systems that are being replaced every year is if we don't do something about them, we're gonna have to come back and do something about them later. So somebody makes a brand new investment of, let's say, $20,000, $40,000 in a new Title V septic system, and we know right now that system is gonna have to have something done to it to get it into compliance. We actually, in the course of discussing this with the Board of Health, and the Board of Health is now looking at this as a regulation and implementing this regulation. The regulation part is probably not too much of a problem. The question is, where do we come up with a 10,000 subsidy for these systems? I'll get into that in a minute.
Kurt, quick question. Do
Sure.
these systems need to be updated, have the materials removed and replenished or refreshed periodically? Is there a cost to that?
There's going to be some O&M, both to monitoring the systems over time. And in terms of your direct question, the current guess is that at about 20 years, the wood chip field is reduced by about 3%.
Oh, okay.
So there's going to be, you can't say no, but these things are easily opened and it's easy to add wood chips at very low cost. So the long-term maintenance is not considered to be a major concern.
Can I just ask, the $10,000, is that what you're estimating is the delta? What somebody would have to pay over and above an existing Title V system?
Yes, right now legally, anybody can put in a Title V. So what we're proposing, along with working with the Board of Health, is a new regulation that would not allow that. And we'd subsidize the cost difference between Title V and a compliant system. And the $10,000, to put that in perspective, if we did sewer hookups for these homes right now, instead of $10,000, you'd be looking at somewhere between $150,000 to $200,000. So that's what the town would be on the hook for if we were hooking them up to a sewage treatment plant, as opposed to $10K subsidizing an advanced treatment Title V system.
And Kurt, as far as the legal arm of this, is it something that's going to be like it's already been permitted and it's allowed, and there's not going to be a bunch of jumping through hoops if a person wants to do this?
That's a great question. In fact, everything in this list is something that we've already discussed with DEP, something that they're fully behind. And there is one little wrinkle with the innovative alternative septic systems, and that is they're not considered general use yet. They're still they're allowed, DEP is allowing them. Once we get to, I think it's 40 systems installed, and they're being installed, by the way, in Barnstable. They're being installed in a number of other locations around the Cape. But at a 40 system installation, then they would be eligible for general use permit. So there wouldn't even be a permitting issue any longer. We alone in the town of Wellfleet, as I said, are doing about 60. If we were doing, we think about 50 would be eligible for doing this advanced retrofit. So, at the time, again, at the time of either new construction or failed system, that's when those folks would be eligible and part of this new Board of Health regulation.
Do these apply as well to businesses? Is there a commercial grade version? Or I think Sarah might want to know the answer to that question.
Title, Scott, do you want to answer that? Scott's on the line.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kurt. I just wanted to let you know I just got on here. Sorry for being a couple minutes late coming from another hearing. Yes, these systems can be used for businesses as well. And I guess I think the way the health regulation is drafted now does not differentiate between a residential and business use, so it would apply. But that's something that I don't think we've talked too much about yet at the Board of Health meeting. Certainly can.
I actually just put in a system when I renovated the Route 6 property. I think our system cost about 25 to 30,000 total. We probably could have done the enhanced treatment for, I'm going to guess, maybe 10, 15,000. So, obviously as the system does scale up in size, it's going to cost more, and the carbon component is going to cost more. We don't have a lot of commercial, and in the numbers that we looked at, we really weren't, considering commercial, but certainly as Scott said, the Board of Health regulation wouldn't preclude somebody from being eligible for that subsidy nonetheless.
Thank you.
So, Scott, do you want to pick up and
That's
take
great.
over?
Sure. Did Helen have a question? I see her hand up here.
I think you're muted, Helen.
Sorry about that. Scott,
Yes.
through you, Fred, what you and I know, and Kurt knows, is that to address what one of the things Kathy said, there are already a lot of alternative systems in Wellfleet. They're just not this newer generation of them.
Yes.
And there are a lot. the Board of Health has been allowing them and the DEP has been allowing them for.
Yeah, I can just highlight that. That's a good point, Helen, and it might be good for other people to be aware of what we're proposing here. There are, I don't know, 6 or 8 technologies that are permitted by DEP that do remove some nitrogen. Just to put some numbers to it, a standard Title V system generates on average around 35 milligrams per liter nitrogen. Some of these other systems will generate around 19 or 20, so it's about almost a 50% reduction. These new systems, there are 3 of them, and we're actually referring to them as enhanced, innovative, and alternative, meaning they do a better job, are getting around 90 to 95% removal down to about 5 milligrams per liter, which is very similar to what a municipal wastewater treatment would provide. And to achieve the numbers that we have to get to, according to the Mass Estuary Project report, we would need to do better than the systems that have been going into the ground that that Helen's referring to. So this new generation of so-called enhanced INAs is really what this health regulation targets. And the way it's written now, the subsidy would only be available for somebody who chooses and agrees to put in one of the enhanced INA systems.
Yes, but
Scott, the technology.
I can't see everyone, so I can only see one image.
I just have it's Sarah, and I just have another question on this. This technology that we're bringing into Massachusetts now, it's technology that's been used in other parts of the country prior to this, right?
Yes, there's actually 3 of these so-called enhanced technologies. One of them is called Nitrex, and that's been used in a number of states across the country. One of them is a system developed by George Heufelder that people have referred to as the layer cake. And that was actually developed down in Florida. They've used a lot of that technology down there, as well as some work in Canada. And the third one is the Nitro system, which is developed by a gentleman on Martha's Vineyard. And that one has primarily been used here in Massachusetts so far. But there's some pretty good track record between the 3 systems. And they're all quite similar. They all use wood chips as the treatment technology.
And if I can interject, if you go back and listen to some of the Board of Health meetings, they did presentations to the Board of Health for both of those systems. And they had a full screen sharing and slideshow for everyone to see how those systems work and which would be better for Wellfleet.
So before we go too far down one path here, since I think we're still on the first bullet, I'm assuming here, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the 5 bullets under preliminary costs are complementary but different. They represent different approaches to wastewater management that would complement each other. So if we could kind of stay on this page and describe it in the sense of what each one of these costs represents, and to the degree that we're looking at alternatives, that's fine, but I don't want to do too deep a dive. We don't have that much time. And we still have a few more pages just on the overview.
Thanks, Fred. I'm going to jump in here and agree with you that I would love to have a further discussion, more in-depth discussion about that. But right now, where it's budget season, I'd love to maybe move this to one of the strategic planning issues, if it isn't anything financial that we're voting on as a budget requirement tonight, just in the interest of time in our voluminous agenda.
Yes.
And to answer the question very quickly, the process here is additive, Fred. In other words, we have certain pieces of this that get us a certain amount of nitrogen reduction, and we've got to get to a target which DEP has set. So we've got to do a variety of different things in order to reach that target.
And the deadline is when?
Well, the deadline for reaching that target is, the real deadline will be whenever CLF decides they're going to sue everybody again. They are threatening to do that. You know, in good faith, we've been working with DEP, and I think on the next slide, you'll see why Why now is sort of that question, you know. We have the requirement, it is a legal requirement. It's part of a settlement with CLF that we move forward on the Cape with an overall 208 plan. We're just one of the towns that's obligated to do that. If we don't move in a pace that DEP is happy with, they do have some strong cudgels. They can, you know, remove our SRF funding. They can do things to us financially that could be pretty painful. But in reality, is there somebody saying you've got to do this tomorrow? No. It's a good faith effort as long as DEP feels like we are making a good faith effort and showing actual concrete actions toward complying. We're not going to see penalties.
So could we reasonably expect that this $1.58 million is money that needs to be spent within the next 2 to 3 years, or 5 or 10? What are we looking at?
So we'll get to that in a minute. I think the answer is 1.5 would be our expectation for next year. But I actually want to put a question out to the Finance Committee right now, because this is one area where we really need your help. And that is thinking about how to fund and finance and set up wastewater as an entity within the town. This could be a revolving fund. It could be an enterprise fund. It could be a department, operating independently. I just want to throw that out because you folks probably have a lot of tremendous expertise that could help us in trying to figure out where this fits. But specific to your question, we expect 1.5 would be next year's budget. And let me just kind of.
When you say next year, you mean FY23?
Yes, we want to put, this will be, our goal is to have this as a town warrant item this year.
Oh, this year, FY22, okay.
Yep, for this spring's town meeting. And so let me just quickly summarize. You got innovative septic systems, you got a 95 Lawrence neighborhood wastewater project, permeable reactive barriers, salt marsh restoration, and shellfish propagation. Each one has a very specific contribution to our overall plan. That's where we come up with the 1.5. And in the interest of time and to not get into the weeds on any of these particular projects, I want to flip to the next slide, which is my page. Let's see, page down. Oop. Well, let me just do it this way. So can you see that, the preliminary grant revenue sources?
Yes.
So that gets to the other side of the equation, which is there are a tremendous number of grant sources that are out there right now to help fund this type of a program. And so what we've done here is identify what those grant sources are. And Scott, do you want to take over there and start to talk about this section?
Sure. I mean, it varies depending on which actions are being undertaken, but first of all, the so-called Airbnb short-term rental revenue, many of the towns on the Cape are using that to fund this wastewater program. And Kurt's been discussing that as a likely possibility here in Wellfleet. So I'm not sure what those revenue numbers are, but the number 500,000 was put in here as an estimate. And that would be a continuing source of money to fund this program. This is likely to be a 30-year program in terms of ultimately getting to the required goal. So it's something that doesn't have to happen this year or next year, but I think DEP wants to see, in fact, I know they want to see movement in a program. So this would be one way to fund that. There is a state loan program, the State Revolving Fund, or SRF, that's available. And there's some forgiveness, meaning they'll actually, in addition to the loan, pay down part of the loan. The town of Chatham received money from U.S. Department of Agriculture to fund part of their wastewater program. So that might be an option here as well. And then there's this Cape Cod Water Protection Fund, which is linked to the SRF, but this is the money that the 15 towns have gotten together, again, related to the Airbnb tax in terms of a funding source, and that Wellfleet can apply to that for funding. And there's a specific area for smaller projects, which Wellfleet might qualify for, that actually has a higher, up to 50% reimbursement. So there's a number of sources here. I won't go through all of them. You can just look down the list. Some of them are repeated under some of these other technologies. There are also EPA and DEP grants. We recently had a meeting with Mass DEP, and they were interested in this permeable reactive barrier project that we've identified in the list, and they may actually contribute towards this. So I think if the town, commits money for these things, that would certainly be some really good seed money to then go out and try to get some matching funds in many cases to try to cost share some of those programs. And so there are a number of so-called grant and loan programs that the town would be qualified for once they begin this process.
The other thing I'd add there too is the willingness of people like DEP and EPA to fund some of this stuff is going to probably start to go away over the next several years. They're not going to continue to do this for every permeable reactive barrier project that comes down the pike. Another interesting opportunity is in the salt marsh restoration. Howes Pond is something that Ryan Curley had identified as, it's a constrained pond, and suffice it to say, the pond is dying. The Conservation Commission really wants to get something done there, and there's nitrogen benefits to doing something about it. So Mass DOT is actually interested in helping to cover the engineering and permitting costs to put in what they call a self-regulating tide gate, which would open that up and start to permit tidal exchange into that area while still protecting the local homeowners. So kind of a cool project, but very significant contribution from Mass DOT, toward that project.
Kurt, if I could just add one other comment regard to the timing that the chair was asking about. These first two bullets, the INA systems and the 95 Lawrence project, these really are things that are going on right now. I'm sure you're aware, just to skip to the 95 Lawrence project, I believe the Board of Selectmen as well as the Housing Committee approved this project to move forward as a so-called neighborhood sewering project. It's really a unique opportunity. We've been describing it as a win-win, provide affordable housing and water quality restoration at the same time, because that project is located in the most impacted watershed, the Duck Creek area. And so this funding, this $150,000, is really for the first step and commitment on that project. And frankly, that's what the developer, the town or the housing trust is going to be putting out an RFP very soon to a developer. And that RFP essentially is going to say, or does say, the town's going to pay for the part of the wastewater treatment plant. And that's what this $150,000 is for, is the design and permitting as a first step in that. So that's very current in terms of what the town wants to move ahead to further on affordable housing. And back up under the INA, as I mentioned before, the standard Title V septic system, as we all know now, doesn't really do anything for nitrogen removal. So everyone that goes in really digs the hole a little deeper, if you will. And we were just talking, there's new systems going in currently in the Duck Creek watershed, standard Title V systems. Unless the town switches and starts using this higher technology, at some point, some of those systems that are being built now might have to be sewered in a number of years. So those people are going to pay twice. They're going to pay for a Title V system and then a sewer in the future to fix the problem, because each one that goes in actually makes the nitrogen problem more significant. So that's why the INA program is very timely. because the town already has a, you know, a goal to meet. And frankly, every week that goal is going to get harder to meet with more of these Title V systems going in. So the sooner the town can act on that and start turning the tide, if you will, on that one would be really helpful. So I just wanted to highlight that some of these things, in fact, are pretty time sensitive, I think.
Thank you for that. I want to say in general, Kurt and Alex in years past, whatever, have come in and presented the wastewater challenges to the Finance Committee over the last few years. In fact, it was, I think, their presentation about 3 years ago that led us to think that we should be starting to think longer term and produce that first and only to date strategic planning report that said, look, here's some big costs that are coming down the pike 2, 3, 4 years out. Be aware of those as a town. Having said that, every time we've had this conversation, and it applies to the Water Enterprise Fund too, I think, to some degree, it's almost like doing a jigsaw puzzle in that you see the pieces of it, but you're trying to get your head wrapped around the whole thing and say, and we understand that we have a challenge to meet DEP requirements for nitrogen depletion. We also understand that technologies change, and each piece of this represents a significant cost, and each, to this slide, there are potential solutions, or there's potential mitigating resources that will reduce those costs for the town. But I personally have trouble putting the whole picture together to see, particularly in terms of the timing and the likelihood that one thing or the other is going to happen, what our confidence factor is in putting all the pieces together and saying, yes, we have the whole picture. And the reason I'm bringing this up in part is because we are going to have to put closure on the meeting at some point, but also because, to Kurt's question before about what the Finance Committee can do to weigh in on one project or another, or the whole picture, you need to have the whole picture. But it's also, in my experience with town finance, you'll go to town meeting this year for $1.5 million, say. There'll be a proposal that the town needs to raise $1.5 million to address the 5 bullets on the previous page. People will ask questions about why this, why that, and details get lost in the narrative very quickly at town meeting. It becomes mind-numbing, and people don't necessarily understand what they're voting for. They have to see the larger good, but then there's the longer term question of wastewater management as it applies 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. We're using numbers like that in this conversation. We're saying this is a 20-year thing, this is a 15-year thing, which is a whole other way of thinking about, to Kurt's question, to the Finance Committee, what is the right way to fund this? What's the right way to present it? Is it a 1-year debt exclusion? Is it a longer term budget commitment? It's very, very hard for me anyway, and I'd love to hear from anyone else on the committee. I'm having a difficult time figuring out how we could possibly answer that question without having a better sense of how all these pieces fit together.
Mr. Chairman, if I make a brief response to that?
Yes, please.
Obviously we don't have a lot of time tonight, but we do have a fairly well thought out, I think, plan how all this fits together. We actually have a calculation on how each one of these strategies over that 30-year period will ultimately meet the nitrogen reduction requirements. That's something that we can certainly have ready for any public hearings preceding town meeting, or maybe even a brief presentation at town meeting, because you're absolutely right. It's important to see how each one of these bullets or components fits into an overall plan. And we do have a draft of that plan at this point in place in terms of spreadsheets and calculations, and how all these do fit together and meet the targets. I will have a written report available before town meeting, and we expect to have public hearings on all this, but the components and the calculations as to how these components get you to the thresholds. We do have that information, and we'd be happy to present it if we have an opportunity to do that when we have a little bit more time than we have tonight.
Yeah, and my goal, Fred, was to start the conversation, because obviously you're not going to approve anything tonight, but to start to get real numbers on paper of what does this really look like over 20 years. So this is an alternative approach, looks like something like $1.5 million a year probably, with the potential for 25 to 75% grant funding, which would substantially reduce the commitment over the next several years. So whether it's a revolving fund, whether it's a department, whether it's an enterprise fund, I just wanted to get in your heads. We're looking at about $1.5 million a year for the next maybe 10 or 15 years, and that's what we think are the realistic numbers, less whatever we can pull in for grants. So that was the main message, and then.
Well, I think there's a secondary part to your message, if I understand it, which is that you have a stair slide, which is your fourth slide, that says, what's the alternative? $150 million sewer within 3 years. And that's always the boogeyman in the scenario, right? It's always,
right.
If we don't do this, we're going to have to spend 7 or 8 times as much that over the 20 million that's going to be spent in the next 10 years or so, or 20 years. And that number as well needs to be vetted for, is that really an accurate number? Is it really within 3 years? Who's going to enforce that? Who's going to say we have to do that within 3 years? Because those are the questions that are going to come up. I mean, those are our questions, I think.
Sure.
It's like,
yeah, if I might, DEP actually required us to do an analysis of the transfer station and we had to go out to bid and spend about $50,000 qualifying the transfer station site as an alternative for sewage treatment. They demanded that we do that because if we don't come up with an alternative plan, they're going to demand that we put the sewer system in.
and the $150 million, at one point we were talking about a smaller sewer system of maybe 50 million. 150 million is the full Monty, right?
150. They're saying if you guys don't have an alternative plan and we have to put in a sewer system, you're going to sewer the entire town.
Fred?
I think what really is needed here, one thing that I think, or two things that are really important that you guys to come back to us with. One is a storyboard that's a multi-year. What are we going to do? What do you see as the sequencing? When are these things going to happen? So I think as you're looking at these plans, it needs to go from this PowerPoint more to a storyboard so we can lay that out. And I think the second thing is really on the financing, and that is, if you could come to us and sort of, and then give us the challenge of how we as a committee might be able to come back with some suggestions on how to finance this. That would, that would be a real good collaboration of what we're able to do in working with you.
That'd be great. Yeah. And I think that alludes to what Scott was saying before. We do have that. We can't present it tonight. We definitely want to come back and talk about specifically, what we've already done. But I wanted to get, a really high level overview of, is this bigger than the Brooklyn Bridge or is it smaller than a breadbasket? So that we start to have some guardrails in terms of what the heck this really looks like for the town of Wellfleet.
Before we put closure on this, Kathy had her hand up and I think you wanted to ask a question, Kathy?
So I just wanted to say, before we move forward on this, because this again is something that comes up and should be in a strategic planning over the next, because again, we're looking at a system that we're going to pay for to put in place, but also to maintain. So I think we get stuck in looking at what the present costs are and then the costs moving forward of something like this. Also, in the presentation, coming from a private sector finance position, I always like to see revenues matched with debt. And I think when you look at $150,000 for the Lawrence Road project, that should not necessarily be in your budget. It should be in the Housing Authority's budget for the project as an all-encompassing cost of that project. So I would like to see those revenues matched with the debt sources matched more with revenues. And I understand that that's not the way that municipal finance works. I would also like to reiterate Stephen's past comments, and I'd like to see I'd like to see an accounting of where that last $500,000 went, so that, you know, just to take a look at for my own brain on how that money was being spent and what the new proposal is for this upcoming, you know, this upcoming source of payments that we're going to need to make, investments that we're going to need to make on this project, just so I can get a better understanding and have a better understanding of where the money has already flowed in trying to tackle this complex issue. So those are just a couple of things that I'd like to look at. Thanks, Fred.
I just
Before we move
wanna
on,
Sorry, I can't see who's talking right now because
it's Sarah.
chart's
It's
still on the screen.
Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I just have one more thing to say on the subject, just because of all the subjects, this is one that I have been through a lot with. And, you know, no technology and no answer is going to be the final answer. But if we can start to look, if we can be very open-minded as a community and start to look at these sorts of technologies as possible ways to solve problems without spending $150 million on a sewer system, we are going to be way ahead of the game when the time comes. And we may lose money here and there in the short term. And, you know, we may overspend on some stupid system, as I have done with 4 septic systems later. But now I understand all these years later what it took to have a system that actually works for the building. So, it's an aside, but it's an important aside going forward. This is something where the technologies are they're complicated and yet they're simple. And I think as a community, we'd be foolish to not put energy and money into this sort of stuff and encourage like a different kind of thought process around sewer.
Oh, Sarah, you know what? Can I jump back in really quick over you, Fred? One more point.
Before you do, could we get the slide presentation off the screen so we can see who's still online?
Yeah.
Go back to screen share. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
So one more thing, I'd love to hear, and again, we tend to commingle a lot of issues because we have to hear the why behind what we're spending. And I'd love to have the Board of Health on here next time to kind of wrap that in and around. So just.
Maria?
thank you, Fred. And, you know, I appreciate the discussion. You know, having done the first watershed improvement plan in Maryland, I can tell you that the outreach piece of this is almost heavier than the financing piece. And, you know, the timeliness of, you know, going to town meeting and asking folks to fund something without doing the education first might not be a good idea. And I just feel like there's a longer range look at utilities in this town that needs to be done. You know, your growth and your expansion and your expectations of your utility systems. And I love that we have, you know, really talented and capable folks on commissions, but at some point this needs to become more of a staff responsibility in some ways so that we can have a long range view. But in order to really move ahead with a plan, you know, people understand a wastewater system. They don't, you know, it took some explaining for me to understand why the town would be paying to upgrade individual homeowners' systems on their property. And I think there needs to be some serious, and this goes beyond let's have a hearing. I think there needs to be some serious outreach and some serious consideration to what the long-term look at both the water and the water systems are and how we're financing them and where the decision-making triggers are and how those budgets are done before we just run to a hearing and looking for financing. Because, you know, there's a lot of people that need to vote on this and also people that need to be convinced to allow somebody to do something on their property that they're not familiar with. So we're headed in the right direction, but I think we've got some steps in the middle that we need to take first.
Thank you, Maria. And before we finish this, I'd just like to say I agree with you 100%. Another way of putting it, I'm trying to say before, is the Finance Committee, whatever position we were to take on individual costs or whatever, is a pass-through. We are an advisory board. At the end of the day, it will be you and the select board and the town that will make fundamental decisions about how to manage wastewater going forward. And that, I think to your point, is a function of what the goals of the town are, and is it growing, is it not growing, and so on, way beyond our scope as a finance committee, at least at this point in time. Because until we have an understanding contextually of what the whole strategy is, and we're happy to participate, I think, by providing some financial perspective, but that's only one small piece of understanding what we're trying to accomplish here. A sewer system, even in and of itself, doesn't accomplish everything. So
Right. It's really a combination, utilities, the way I see it. It's water, it's wastewater, and stormwater management. Because we're looking at nitrogen removal, we're really looking at what our discharge is. And I think we need to also look at how we're managing or not managing stormwater at the same time. So,
yeah, that's well said. And actually, one of the things that drove us to even consider doing a strategic plan a few years ago was, as I recall, Kurt and Alex Hay came in and they were talking about this sort of comprehensive water in, water out flow. And we started thinking, well, gee, the whole town is about water when you get right down to it, including recreation in the harbor and aquaculture and nitrogen depletion and so on. We should be thinking about this in a broader context than trying to treat them as individual and isolated elements of life in this town. But
water defines the town of Wellfleet.
yes, it does, as it does the Cape. So we are, I think I can speak for the committee to say we're happy to participate. We certainly can't define solutions that, even if we could, they would be forwarded to the actual governing authorities. So with that, I want to thank Scott and Kurt for the presentation. I think this is an ongoing process. I'm not trying to
I don't mean to interrupt, Fred, but I wanted to let you know that at the select board meeting last night, town meeting was voted for June 5th, with the rain date being the following Saturday, just to give you all a heads up.
Oh, well, that's interesting. So we have all kinds of time. We could revisit this, say, in March or April then.
Rebecca, could you send us the PowerPoint that Kurt had, and also a link to with the board, was it the Board of Public Health? Where you said they had those discussions?
Absolutely. Yep, I'll send you the minutes. I'll send you the recordings, and I'll send you the slideshow that Kurt shared with you this evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Sure.
you.
And
Fred, the only other thing I want to mention is, with respect to timing again, as Scott said, we have a ticking time bomb with septic systems that are going in the ground now. And we also have this 95 Lawrence Road project that's going out to bid. And those two items require action at town meeting, both of them, in my opinion. So, and I fully appreciate Maria's perspective on this in terms of outreach. We're trying to get our arms around this problem as much as you folks are as well, because there's so many moving pieces. The real challenge with an alternative strategy is in other words, Scott and I were just having this discussion today. The easiest thing in the world for the wastewater committee to do is to put a bond to the town for $150 million for a sewer system. That is the easiest thing for us to do. What we're engaged in right now is extremely, extremely difficult, much more confusing, and much less clear than pipes in the ground.
Kurt?
So that's the only thing I just wanted to provide that perspective, because, it's really up to the town what the town wants to do. We're just trying to provide alternatives.
Kurt, it's Kathy Graham. Can I jump
with
in?
that, I'm going to suggest we table this conversation. I'm sorry.
Can I
I'm going to
ask one
suggest we
quick
table this
question?
conversation.
Can I ask
Yeah.
one quick question, Fred, of Kurt, while I have him on the phone?
Yes.
Kurt, on the computer. Kurt, why wouldn't the septic issues, if you're putting that 95 Lawrence Road out to bid, why wouldn't those septic issues be addressed in the construction bid for the project?
They actually are, and we can have the discussion offline because it's an interesting public-private partnership. And, we came up with the consultant that was working on the project with a cost share arrangement. The project 95 Lawrence is going to cover its costs for septic and for sewage treatment. That project can't go forward, most likely cannot go forward unless there's a reduction in nitrogen in the Duck Creek watershed.
Okay, so, but that's going to be taken care of. So that is
Well, but let me explain how, because the only way you can get a reduction in the watershed with a bunch of housing units going in there is to reduce nitrogen someplace else. And so what Scott and the consultant worked on was a strategy of including the police, fire, school, and part of the neighborhood into a combined treatment facility so that you ultimately can reduce nitrogen in that watershed. Win-win, because nitrogen goes down, but it's complicated to put something like that together. And if we don't do it, the project can't go forward.
Okay, thanks for that. I appreciate it. Sorry, Fred, that I just ran you over, but
That's okay. This
I've
is
been
very
working on
interesting
two
stuff.
all day. I'm
But-
tired.
I think every time we have this conversation, we are overwhelmed with the science and try to make sense of the science in the context of a living, breathing town, and what individuals and aggregate groups need. We will revisit this subject, I promise, particularly if there's a big ticket item attached to it. I'm going to suggest that nobody has a liaison report tonight, unless somebody feels an urgent need to present one. There are no transfers. There was correspondence from Bill Dugan relative to a similar argument that was made to the Finance Committee last year about school choice. Do we need it? And should the high school project go forward or not? You have that correspondence. I suggest you read it. I will just say briefly, as we did last year, the schools will be coming in next month and we can discuss this at greater length. But the question of school choice is not the Finance Committee's choice to make. And the question from my perspective is not as simple as if you have a smaller school, you pay less with fewer students. There are many complexities, many of which we touched on with the water issue, which is how many students, how many young people are going to be here in 20 years? How many of them are going to have families? How many kids will be in the school system? The MSBA, the funding source for the school renovation or part of it, set the number of students they want the school to be able to accommodate. And it is in excess of the number that would be present if there were no school choice. So on and on and on. There are many, many questions. We voted last year to approve the article as it stood in the warrant at that time. We'll have a chance to dive deeper into this question when we meet with the schools in about a month. And that's all I'm going to say on that subject. With that, if anybody has anything at all, I'm happy to hear it. But otherwise, I would suggest we take a motion to adjourn. And
So moved. Oh,
second,
no, I can't say that. Motion, I moved the motion.
move the motion and have a second, please.
I'm gonna move it to somebody else.
Second.
If anybody is opposed to that motion, this is your chance to say so. Otherwise, thank you so much. Thanks for everybody's participation
Thanks,
too.
Fred.
We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Great
Bye.
job, Fred.
Hi,
Good night.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Fred.
All right, now go away.